Nathan Caldwell was a man who had never been denied anything. His presence commanded any room, his name carried power, and his wealth made him untouchable. Yet, as he sat on the sleek leather couch of his penthouse, whiskey swirling between his fingers, he felt something foreign, restlessness. Madeline was in the bedroom, probably reading one of her books, completely unaware of the storm inside him. She had always been that way, gentle, patient, predictable. So different from the women he encountered at high-profile events, so distant from what he now believed he needed. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his sharp eyes staring at his reflection in the massive glass windows overlooking the city skyline. Why did it feel like something was missing? The answer hit him the moment he closed his eyes and recalled the last gala he had attended alone. A woman, voluptuous, confident, built to be desired, had run a teasing hand down his chest and smiled, knowingly, as if offering something he had been deprived of for too long. And Madeline, she would never do something like that. She would never challenge him, never ignite his hunger the way that other woman had. Her slender frame, her quiet nature. It wasn't enough. Exhaling, he set down his glass and pushed himself up from the couch. The decision had been brewing for weeks, and now it felt inevitable. He walked toward the bedroom. Madeline was curled up on the bed, wearing a simple cotton pajama set, her bare feet tucked beneath her as she flipped through the pages of a novel. Her wavy chestnut hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and when she looked up at him, there was warmth in her brown eyes. "You're home late. I thought you'd be at the office longer." Nathan didn't respond right away. He simply stood there watching. A voice deep inside warned him that he was about to destroy something irreplaceable, but his conviction was stronger. "We need to talk." Madeline frowned slightly, closing her book. "What's wrong?" He sat at the edge of the bed, his gaze steady. "I want a divorce." Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Her fingers tightened around the book, knuckles turning white. "What?" Nathan didn't waver. "I've changed. We've changed. We're not right for each other anymore. You deserve someone who appreciates you as you are, and I—" He hesitated, because her eyes were burning with something he had never seen before. It wasn't sadness. It was disbelief. "I deserve—" Her voice came out low, rough, dangerous. "Madeline, no." She swung her legs off the bed, rising abruptly, her expression unreadable. "You're telling me that after everything, you just decided you don't want me anymore?" Nathan ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "It's not that simple. I need something different." Madeline laughed, but it was sharp and bitter. "Something different?" She crossed her arms, her gaze pinning him in place. "You mean someone different?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. This time her silence was different, colder. And then, without shedding a single tear, she said something he would never forget. "You're going to regret this, Nathan." He stood there for a moment, that strange discomfort, clawing at his chest, but he ignored it. He never regretted anything. Turning on his heel, he walked out of the bedroom, and he didn't look back. Madeline stood frozen in the middle of the bedroom, the echo of Nathan's words still slicing through her like a blade. "I want a divorce." The room around her felt suffocating, too small to contain the storm brewing inside. Her pulse pounded against her skin, her breath shallow as her hands trembled against the soft fabric of her pajama top. She had always been slender, delicate. Too delicate, apparently. The kind of woman men adored in silence but never craved with hunger. Nathan had just confirmed what she had feared for years. She wasn't enough. A hollow laugh escaped her lips, dry and bitter. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror across the room. Brown eyes that once sparkled with warmth now looked empty, haunted. Her collarbones jutted out sharply beneath the thin straps of her top. Her waist, narrow and fragile, was something he once traced absent-mindedly in bed, like she was an afterthought. She had loved him with everything she had, given him everything, and in return, he had discarded her like an old accessory that no longer suited his taste. A vibration snapped her out of her trance. Her phone. She hesitated before picking it up. "Helena, Are you okay? Call me. Madeline exhaled, her throat tight. No, she wasn't okay. Before she could respond, another message popped up. Helena, I saw Nathan tonight. He wasn't alone. A sharp, searing pain ignited in her chest. So that was it. It wasn't just that he didn't want her. He had already replaced her. The air left her lungs in short, shallow bursts as her vision blurred. Her grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles ached. The thought of him, of his hands, his mouth, his body, on someone else, made her stomach twist into something ugly, something raw. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He had already moved on. Madeline staggered to the dresser, her fingers fumbling over the thin gold band on her left hand. It had once symbolized everything. A promise, a future, a lie. With a sharp pull, she yanked the ring off her finger and slammed it onto the marble countertop. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, a mix of grief and something darker, something dangerous, flooding her veins. She ran a hand through her hair, gripping the strands at the roots, forcing herself to breathe. She could fall apart. She could crumble, let the weight of his rejection crush her until there was nothing left, or she could become something else entirely. A slow exhale left her lips. Nathan had made one mistake. He thought he had left her behind, but he had just unleashed something he would never be able to control. The city lights blurred through the taxi window as Madeline pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her fingers gripping the hem of her coat like it was the only thing holding her together. She felt hollow, weightless, as if a single gust of wind could shatter her into pieces. She had walked out of that apartment like a ghost, barely aware of her own movements. The ring she had thrown onto the dresser felt like it had taken a part of her with it, leaving her skin exposed, vulnerable. Her body, slender, delicate, had always been something Nathan barely noticed. Now it felt like proof of why he had left. Her thighs didn't fill out a dress the way other women's did. Her chest, small and subtle, had never been enough to make him desperate to touch her. She wasn't the kind of woman who made men lose control. She had been comfortable, predictable, forgettable. The realization made her stomach clench, a sharp ache twisting inside her. She squeezed her eyes shut. The images came uninvited. Nathan's hands on another woman, one with curves that demanded attention, lips that knew how to tease, a body built to be devoured. He had probably already explored every inch of her, touched her in ways he had never touched Madeline. A soft, shuddering breath escaped her lips. Pain curled inside her, but underneath it, something else flickered. Something dark, something hot. Anger. Not just at him, but at herself. For years she had waited for him to notice her, to crave her, to look at her like she was something he couldn't resist. But men like Nathan didn't chase women like her. They chased women who demanded to be wanted. Her eyes flickered open. The taxi was nearing her destination. She didn't want to feel like this anymore, small, weak, invisible. If she was going to hurt, then she would make it mean something. By the time the car stopped, her hands had steadied. The fire in her veins had grown. She stepped out into the night, her heels clicking against the pavement. The air was cold, but she didn't shiver. Nathan thought she would break. He had no idea what he had just created. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized. Madeline stood in the dimly lit bedroom, her breath steady as she let the silk slip off her shoulders, pooling at her feet. The soft glow from the vanity lights traced the new contours of her body, lean, toned, yet undeniably feminine. Months of relentless effort had carved her into something stronger, something Nathan would no longer overlook. Her hands traveled down her sides, feeling the smoothness of her skin, the firm curves that had started to take shape. She wasn't just fragile anymore. Her waist was still slender, but now it dipped into hips that moved with a slow, deliberate sway when she walked. Her thighs, once narrow, now had just enough muscle to hint at the power she had built. She turned slightly, catching the shadow of her back, sculpted, poised, untouchable. Her fingers traced her collarbones, her jawline, the sharp yet delicate angles of her face. Everything about her was different now. The door behind her creaked open. "You're lost in thought." Madeline didn't startle. She had felt his presence before he spoke. Raphael leaned against the doorway, his dark eyes trailing over her bare skin without shame. Not like Nathan used to, distant, indifferent. No. Raphael looked at her like she was something to be unraveled, something to be discovered. His gaze burned as it traced the curve of her shoulder, the delicate dip of her lower back. She wasn't covered, and yet she had never felt more in control. "You're staring," she murmured, turning slightly, just enough for him to see the slow curl of her lips. "I'd be blind not to." His voice was deep, rich, the kind that sent a slow warmth spiraling through her stomach. He stepped closer and she let him. The heat of his body wrapped around her before he even touched her, the air between them thick with unspoken promises. Then, his fingers brushed against her wrist, light, barely there, but electric. "Tell me something, Madeline." She tilted her chin up, holding his gaze. "Does he still haunt you?" A sharp exhale left her lips. Nathan's face flickered in her mind. His arrogance, his rejection, the way he had walked away without a second thought. Her pulse thrummed, but not with pain. Not anymore. Slowly she stepped closer, feeling the warmth of Raphael's breath against her cheek. Her lips brushed the edge of his jaw, not quite a kiss, but something close. Then, with the slightest smirk, she whispered, "Not anymore." And for the first time in her life, Madeline was the one walking away, leaving someone else wanting more. Madeline felt the weight of every step she took. The silk of her dress hugged her body perfectly, caressing every curve she had worked so hard to sculpt. The slit ran high against her thigh, teasing glimpses of smooth-toned skin as she moved through the grand ballroom. Every eye followed her, but she only cared about one. She felt him before she saw him, Raphael. The moment her gaze met his, the air between them shifted, dense, electric, alive. He didn't just look at her. He devoured her with his eyes, slowly, deliberately, as if he were memorizing every inch of her body. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't falter. She walked toward him with the confidence she had earned, the subtle sway of her hips accentuated by the way his gaze darkened with every step. By the time she reached him, the space between them felt suffocating. "You're late," Raphael murmured, his voice deep and smooth like heat sliding over her skin. Madeline tilted her head slightly, letting her lips part just enough for him to catch the slight rise of her breath. "I like making an entrance," a slow smirk played at his lips. "You certainly did." The rich scent of his cologne mixed with the heady aroma of champagne and warm candlelight. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the way his presence wrapped around her like an unspoken challenge. Then, just as she expected, he touched her. His fingers brushed against her bare shoulder, featherlight at first, before trailing. Lower, following the delicate line of her arm. The sensation sent a slow pulse through her body, her skin awakening under his touch. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who belongs in someone's shadow," he murmured, his breath teasing the shell of her ear. Madeline's pulse quickened, but her smirk didn't waver. "That's because I'm not." Raphael's gaze flickered over her lips, and for a moment she thought he might close the distance between them. She felt the heat coil low in her stomach, the tension stretching thin between them. But before anything could happen, before she could let herself fall too fast too soon, she stepped back, his brow lifted slightly, intrigued. Leaving so soon? Madeline's fingers trailed along his wrist as she moved past him, her lips barely brushing his cheek. "I like making an exit too." And as she walked away, she didn't need to turn around to know. He was watching and wanting, just the way she wanted him to. Madeline could feel the weight of Raphael's stare on her back as she walked across the ballroom, the slow sway of her hips deliberate, designed to drive him insane. She didn't rush. She wanted him to want. And he did. The energy between them crackled, thick with unspoken promises. She could practically feel his breath against her skin, even from across the room. When she finally turned, Raphael was still standing where she had left him, a glass of whiskey resting loosely in his hand, but his grip had tightened. His gaze was locked on her, dark and full of something dangerously tempting. Madeleine took a slow sip of champagne, letting her lips linger on the rim of the glass just long enough for his eyes to drop there. She smiled. Good. She wasn't the woman who had been discarded anymore. She was the one who dictated the rules now. The night continued, but the game between them never stopped. Every glance, every accidental touch, every smirk exchanged across the room, it all built into something undeniable. Then, just as she was reaching for another glass, she felt the presence behind her. Heat, strength. Raphael. His fingers grazed the inside of her wrist before his palm settled there, possessive but not forceful. "I think you enjoy making men chase you," he murmured, voice rough, dangerous. Madeleine exhaled slowly, pulse thrumming against his touch. "I enjoy making. The right ones work for it." Raphael chuckled, a low, rich sound that sent warmth curling through her stomach. "Is that what I am?" His lips hovered near her ear, breath warm against her skin. "The right one?" Madeleine turned slightly, just enough for their bodies to brush. The friction was intoxicating. Her fingers drifted over his forearm, nails grazing the fabric of his suit as she looked up at him through thick lashes. "That depends." "On what?" She leaned in, her lips barely touching the edge of his jaw. As she whispered, "How good you are at chasing." Then with a slow, deliberate smile, she slipped away, leaving Raphael standing there, breathless, intrigued, and utterly captivated. Madeleine didn't need to turn around to know that Raphael was following her. She could feel it. The tension between them was too sharp, too raw, pulling them together like a force of nature. The quiet hallway outside the ballroom was dimly lit, the golden glow casting long shadows against the polished walls. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked toward the balcony, the cool night air teasing against her skin. And then, heat. Raphael's presence consumed the space before he even touched her, his body so close behind hers that the warmth of him sent shivers down her spine. Madeleine exhaled slowly, placing both hands on the stone railing, her back arching slightly as she felt his breath ghost over her bare shoulder. "You like running, don't you?" His voice was low, thick with something dangerous. She tilted her head just enough for her cheek to brush against his. "I like seeing who's willing to chase." His hands landed on her hips, firm, demanding. The contrast between his rough grip and the delicate silk of her dress sent a pulse of heat straight to her core. "And if I catch you?" His fingers tightened slightly, dragging her closer, her back flush against his chest. Then what? A slow, delicious thrill coiled inside her. Madeleine turned in his arms, their bodies perfectly aligned, her breath mingling with his in the night. Ere she let her fingers trail up his chest, feeling the hard planes beneath the fine fabric of his suit. The way his muscles tensed under her touch only fueled the fire between them. "That depends," she murmured, tilting her chin up, lips a breath away from his. Raphael's jaw tightened, his hands sliding down the curve of her waist, fingers pressing into her hips as if testing his restraint. "On what?" His voice was rough now, raw with want. She smiled, slow and wicked. "How well you play the game." His control snapped. Raphael's mouth crashed against hers, hot, demanding, utterly consuming. Madeleine gasped into the kiss, her hands gripping his shoulders as he pressed her back against the railing, his body firm and unyielding against hers. His fingers traced the bare skin along her spine, sending shivers through her as he pulled her even closer, as if closing the space between them wasn't enough. His lips moved with purpose, slow, then deep, teasing, then relentless. Madeleine's nails dug into the fabric of his suit, her body igniting under his touch. He kissed her like a man who had waited too long, who wasn't willing to let her slip away again. When he finally broke away, his forehead rested against hers, their breaths heavy, mingling in the cool air. "I don't lose, Madeleine," he murmured. his thumb tracing her lower lip. She smiled against his touch, her pulse still racing. "Neither do I." And as his lips found hers again, she knew she had just rewritten the rules of the game. Madeleine could still feel Raphael's lips on hers, the imprint of his touch seared into her skin like fire. Her body was still humming, heated, aware. But she wasn't the only one left shaken. She saw it in his eyes, the hunger, the need, the frustration of a man who wasn't used to being denied. Good. She wanted him to feel what she had felt for so long, wanting something just out of reach, without a word. She slid past him, her fingers grazing the front of his suit as she turned, the deliberate touch light enough to tease but strong enough to make him ache for more. She didn't rush as she walked away, letting the long slit of her dress part just enough with each step to reveal the smooth curve of her thigh. She knew he was watching. She wanted him to, but she wasn't prepared for what happened next. Just as she reached the end of the hallway, a new presence filled the air, one colder, sharper. She felt it before she saw him. Nathan. Her breath hitched, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she turned, her expression unreadable as she met his gaze. He looked furious. His broad frame was tense, hands shoved deep into his pockets like he was barely restraining himself. The deep, knowing way his eyes roamed over her body sent a rush of something dark through her veins. He was looking at her like he had just realized what he had thrown away. Good. She lifted her chin, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Nathan. His jaw tightened. Madeleine. The way he said her name was different now, like it tasted foreign on his tongue. Like it belonged to someone else. She watched the flicker of something raw pass through his features as his gaze dipped over her dress, the way it clung to her curves, the way her confidence made her even more beautiful. "You've changed." His voice was rough, almost accusing. She arched a brow. "I thought that's what you wanted." A muscle ticked in his jaw. He took a slow step closer, his voice dropping. "Not like this." Madeleine's pulse thrummed, but she didn't move. Nathan wasn't just looking at her, he was devouring her. The way his eyes darkened as they dragged over her bare shoulders, down the slope of her waist, the curves he had once ignored. Now, he couldn't look away. And that made something inside her ignite. "Let him burn." She tilted her head, letting her lips part slightly as she took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, just enough for him to catch her scent. "Careful, Nathan." His breath hitched. "Why?" His voice was dangerously low. She leaned in just enough for her lips to brush the shell of his ear, her breath hot against his skin. "You almost sound jealous." Then she turned, leaving him standing there, tense, shaken, and completely consumed. She had his obsession now, but she was the one in control. Nathan's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched Madeleine walk away. Each slow, deliberate step was a taunt, a promise, a punishment. His fists clenched at his sides. She wasn't supposed to be like this. Madeleine had always been soft, gentle, someone who existed quietly in the background of his life. But the woman who had just brushed past him, her perfume lingering in the air, was something entirely different. Confident, seductive, untouchable, and worse, not his anymore. His teeth clenched as he turned, following the sway of her hips with an intensity that burned through his veins. She knew exactly what she was doing to him, and he wasn't going to let it go unanswered. Before she could disappear down the hallway, he reached for her, not forcefully, but possessively. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, warm and strong, holding her still. The moment their skin connected, he felt it, the spark, the hunger, the goddamn craving he never used to have for her. Madeleine sucked in a sharp breath, her body tensing for just a second before she turned slowly to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were fire. Nathan stepped closer, his grip loosening just enough to let his thumb graze the soft skin of her wrist. He felt the way her pulse quickened beneath his touch. "Good. You want to pretend this doesn't exist?" His voice was low, controlled, but the tension was unmistakable. That you don't still feel it? Madeline arched a brow, her lips parting slightly as she let her gaze drop to his mouth, just for a second, just enough to make him insane. Then she smiled, slow, infuriating, beautiful. You gave up the right to ask me that. Nathan exhaled sharply, his free hand lifting to trace the air just above her waist, so close but not quite touching. His fingers hovered over the delicate silk of her dress, aching to grip, to hold, to pull her against him like he should have done before. His voice dropped to a whisper. Tell me to let go. Her breath hitched. He saw it, felt it. The slight tremor of her body as his fingers skimmed the side of her arm, barely there, but enough to make her shiver. She didn't step away. She didn't tell him to stop. She just held his gaze, her brown eyes burning with something dangerous, something tempting. Then, after a long, agonizing second, she pulled her wrist from his grasp, slowly, deliberately, and stepped back. Nathan's jaw tightened as she leaned in, her lips brushing so close to his ear that he could feel her smile. You're too late. Then she was gone, her scent still in the air, her body still a memory against his skin. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Caldwell knew what it felt like to lose. Madeline's skin was still burning where Nathan had touched her. His grip had been strong, familiar, too familiar. But she had walked away, and that alone was power. But as she stepped onto the terrace, the night air cooling the fire running through her veins, she realized she wasn't alone. Raphael was already there. He stood near the balcony, hands in his pockets, his dark eyes watching her with quiet intensity, not with anger, not with desperation, but with something far more dangerous, certainty. Madeline's breath slowed. He had seen everything, the way Nathan, and yet Raphael wasn't unsettled. He wasn't threatened. He was waiting. She approached him slowly, aware of every shift in her body, the way the slit of her dress parted as she moved, revealing smooth, toned skin that caught the moonlight. Raphael let his gaze drop, just for a second. Then he met her eyes again. Was that supposed to mean something? His voice was deep, steady, like he already knew the answer. Madeline exhaled, tilting her head slightly, watching the way his fingers curled against the railing, controlled but barely. Does it bother you? Raphael's lips twitched, almost amused. No, she raised a brow. No? He took a step toward her, the space between them vanishing. I don't compete, Madeline. His fingers brushed the curve of her hip, so light, but enough to send a slow pulse of heat through her. His touch was nothing like Nathan's. Nathan had taken. Raphael. He made her want to give. She inhaled sharply as his hand slid lower, his palm settling against the small of her back. His body was close, warm, powerful, but unhurried. He wants you back, Raphael murmured, his breath teasing her cheek. Madeline didn't move. I know. His thumb traced a slow, agonizing circle against her spine. And? She swallowed. His other hand lifted, fingers sliding under her chin, tilting her face toward his. His touch was firm, but infuriatingly slow. He wanted her to feel it, to crave it. Her lips parted as he leaned in, their breaths mingling, so close but not enough. And I want to see him suffer, Raphael smirked. Then without hesitation he kissed her. Madeline gasped into his mouth as the tension between them snapped, his lips claiming hers with devastating control, deep, consuming. His hands gripped her hips, pulling her fully against him, every inch of her body meeting the hard heat of his. Her fingers tangled in his hair, nails scraping against his scalp as she let him take. Devour. This wasn't about possession, this was about choice. And for the first time, Madeline was choosing herself. Madeline's body melted into Raphael's as his lips claimed hers with slow, deliberate hunger. He wasn't rushed, he wasn't desperate. He kissed her like he had all the time in the world to ruin her. And God, she wanted to be ruined. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his suit, needing something to hold on to as his hands traced fire along her skin. One slid down her back, pressing into the small of it, keeping her flush against his chest. The other, dangerous, possessive, traveled lower, skimming the curve of her hip, grazing her thigh where her dress parted. She gasped against his mouth as his fingers pressed against the bare skin there. A slow, teasing touch that sent heat curling deep in her stomach. Raphael pulled back just slightly, his lips brushing hers, his breath heavy and controlled. Too controlled. "You taste dangerous," he murmured, his voice rough, thick with something dark. Madeleine let out a shaky breath, her own control slipping. "And you—" She swallowed, her nails dragging down the sharp lines of his shoulders, "are playing with fire." His smirk was devastating. "I don't mind getting burned." Then he kissed her again, but this time it wasn't careful. It was heat and hunger, teeth and tongue. His hand gripped the back of her neck, angling her where he wanted, deepening the kiss until she had no choice but to give in. She moaned into his mouth, her body arching, pressing into the hard, solid frame of him. His fingers slid along her thigh, higher, rougher, teasing the edge of the silk where her dress threatened to slip just a little too far. Her breathing turned ragged as his lips moved lower. A sharp gasp left her as his mouth found the delicate skin along her jaw, then lower, tracing a slow path down her throat, his tongue flicking just enough to make her shiver. Madeleine's head tipped back, her hands fisting in his hair as he pressed her into the cold railing. The contrast between the night air and the heat of his body sent shivers cascading down her spine. She felt him smile against her skin. "Sensitive," he murmured, dragging his teeth lightly across her pulse point before soothing it with his tongue. Her breath hitched. "Raphael." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark gaze scorching. "Say my name again." Madeleine's pulse pounded as she met his stare, a dangerous thrill curling through her veins. "Raphael." His lips parted slightly, his chest rising and falling as his hands tightened on her hips. "Good girl." Her stomach clenched. Heat, want, desperation. But just as she felt herself losing completely, the moment shattered. A sharp voice cut through the night. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Both their heads snapped toward the sound. Nathan. His eyes were burning. His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body caught. Madeleine barely had time to catch her breath before he stalked toward them, and she knew this wasn't just a game anymore. This was war. Nathan's presence was like a storm rolling in, thick with rage, charged with something dark and possessive. His fists clenched at his sides as he stopped just a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with deep, barely restrained breaths. His gaze, unsharp, burning, furious, locked onto Madeleine. She felt the weight of it, the heat, the anger, the regret, but it didn't shake her, because Raphael was still there, solid, steady, unbothered. His grip on her waist didn't waver. His thumb traced a slow, calculated circle against the bare skin of her back, a silent claim. A reminder. Nathan's eyes flickered to that touch, and something inside him snapped. "You think this is funny?" His voice was low, sharp, dangerous. Madeleine inhaled slowly, tilting her head. "I think it's overdue." Nathan exhaled, harshly, his jaw locking. "You don't belong to him." The words sliced through the air like a command, a desperate, arrogant, foolish command. Madeleine arched a brow, taking a deliberate step forward, forcing Nathan to take in every inch of the woman he had abandoned. "And I ever belonged to you?" Nathan's lips parted slightly, his hands twitching like he wanted to grab her, shake her, drag her back into the past where she had been small, fragile, his. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She let her fingers trail slowly along the edge of Raphael's suit jacket, an absent touch that made Raphael smirk and Nathan seethe. Nathan's eyes flashed. "So this is what you want?" His voice was rough now, laced with something close to desperation. Madeleine took another step, her body so close to his that she could feel the heat radiating off him. Nathan's breath caught. His gaze dropped, her lips, her neck, the soft curves. He had never appreciated before. She leaned in just enough for her scent to wrap around him, for her breath to tease his skin. "What I want." She let her lips barely brush the shell of his ear, just like she had done before. But this time it wasn't a challenge, it was a goodbye. is to watch you suffer." Nathan's entire body stiffened, his jaw clenched. His breathing went ragged, and Madeline smiled. She pulled back slowly, deliberately, her fingers grazing Raphael's as she turned toward him instead, choosing him. Nathan watched, frozen, as Raphael's hand slid back onto her waist. Secure, confident, undeniable. She didn't look at Nathan again. She didn't have to, because as Raphael's lips brushed the corner of her mouth, pressing a slow, claiming kiss against her skin, Nathan finally understood. He had lost, and this time, she wasn't looking back, and as Madeline let Raphael pull her in for another devastating, slow-burning kiss, she knew Nathan Caldwell would never recover. She was no longer his. She was finally hers. Nathan stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The ice had melted, much like the last remnants of his pride. Across the room, she was glowing. Madeline. Chavtuam, woman he had walked away from. The woman he had dismissed as too fragile, too small, too easy. The woman he thought he could replace, but she had become something untouchable. She moved with effortless confidence, her dress hugging curves he had never taken the time to appreciate. Her laughter, light, rich, seductive, wasn't his to hear anymore. Her touch, her scent, her body, all of it belonged to someone else now. To him. Raphael stood beside her, his hand resting low on her back, his thumb absently stroking the exposed skin there. Possessive, effortless, certain. The way Madeline leaned into him, the way she smiled up at him, her eyes dark with something intimate, it wrecked Nathan. She had never looked at him like that, not once, because he had never given her a reason to. His fingers tightened around his. They glass, his breathing slow and controlled, but inside he was unraveling. For the first time in his life, Nathan Caldwell knew what true regret tasted like. It was bitter. It was slow. It was permanent, because no matter how much he wanted to fix it, no matter how much he wished he could take back his mistakes, Madeline was already gone, and she wasn't coming back. Somewhere else. Madeline exhaled softly as Raphael's lips brushed the top of her ear, his voice deep and teasing. "He's still watching you!" She smiled, swirling the champagne in her glass before tilting her head just enough to meet Raphael's gaze. "Let him," Raphael chuckled, his fingers pressing slightly into the curve of her hip. "You enjoy watching him suffer, don't you?" Madeline. His eyes darkened, and in one smooth motion, he pulled her in, his lips claiming hers in a slow, deep, devastating kiss. Madeline melted into him, her body responding instantly, heat curling in her stomach as his hand slid lower, gripping her thigh where the slit of her dress parted. And when she finally pulled away, her lips swollen, her breathing unsteady, she let her gaze flicker toward Nathan, just once. He looked ruined. Good. Because she wasn't his mistake to fix anymore. She was finally, truly free. And as Raphael leaned in, whispering something delicious against her ear before pressing another lingering kiss to her neck, she let Nathan Caldwell fade into nothing, just like he had done to her. Some losses don't happen all at once. They happen in silence, in neglect, in arrogance. Nathan believed Madeline would always be there, until she wasn't. Until she became something he could never have again, and now he had to live with that choice. But what about you? Have you ever had someone realize too late what they lost? Or have you ever been the one who walked away stronger? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you love stories filled with passion, betrayal, and redemption, don't stop here. There's another intense, irresistible romance waiting for you on the screen. Click now and dive into your next obsession.